Let's start off the program, though, in the United States. Despite the ongoing pandemic crisis hitting many more nations, especially South Asia and South America, there's no doubt that protests, riots and looting in the US has been the biggest story in the world this past week.
It does appear that fire is the police station.
Amid all that chaos last night, there was actually a shooting at 12:30 in the morning, right around the corner from where we're standing. Right here.
Chaotic protests in at least 30 major cities across the United States.
Now, surely most of us have seen the horrific killing of African-American George Floyd by now. A convicted armed robber and drug offender who'd been jailed a number of times, Floyd was picked up on suspicion of passing counterfeit money, and the callousness, cruelty and sheer injustice of his killing must be kept in mind when we look at what followed. So we better show you some of that horrible footage again.
What do you want?
I can't breathe. Please, the knee in my dick. I can't breathe shit.
Now, that went on for more than 8 minutes, with onlookers begging for the police to ease up before Floyd died. For the media, surely it's one thing to acknowledge the anger of protesters over this incident and systemic racism and repeated police brutality against African Americans, but it's quite another to offer any comfort or excuse for those embracing violence and looting in response.
The anger and grief being vented on the streets is no longer just about the justice for George Floyd. Injustice in this deeply fractured nation has many faces and causes. This is Catherine Diss in Washington.
All motivated by injustice? Think again. Even high-profile Democrat leaders are acknowledging this has gone far beyond legitimate protest.
Authorities say they suspect outside agitators are hijacking peaceful protests across the country after days of what has appeared at times to be organized and orchestrated chaos. Law enforcement here in New York.
People who came to do violence in a systematic, organized fashion. That is a different reality we need to grapple with.
The mayor says the feel of protests at times right now is like nothing he's ever witnessed in a city that has seen its share of civil disobedience.
I want Joe Biden to make sure he listens to this. You do not have my vote unless you oppose defunding the police. I will hound you throughout the city. Secondly, I want you to, other words, law and order. Everyone wants law and order. And for you not to mention or address the issue of the police department is ridiculous.
Yet rather than stand up for law and order, demand law and order, there are some in the media who seem to be suggesting it might be best if journalists avoided reporting the criminal reality.
But David, if that's true, the point that these activists are making is that by focusing on the fact there's looting or whatever kind of violence you're seeing from within these protests, you're actually sidestepping the main issue, which is to say that there are things that governments, state governments, could be doing right now that would help quell these protests and maybe prevent these sorts of things happening in future that are just simply not being done, and that's really where the focus should be.
And even those in the thick of the action, acknowledging the legitimate grievances of peaceful protesters, still talk about those same grievances motivating the destruction around them.
There's two really distinct elements. There's a lovely undercurrent of peaceful protesters here who want to talk about their stories, growing up as black people in this country, the systemic racism which needs to change. And those are powerful messages. Unfortunately, Mark, they're getting drowned out by what you are seeing right now. And those are the protesters who are so angry and they are motivated to destroy this. Whoa! All right, we're moving back.
CNN host Chris Cuomo, the brother of New York Democrat Governor Andrew Cuomo, made excuses for the lawlessness.
Now, too many see the protests as the problem. No, the problem is what forced your fellow citizens to take to the streets: persistent and poisonous inequities and injustice. And please, show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
Well, I'll tell you where it says that protests should be polite and peaceful. It's actually the law. It's against the law to assault people, attack police, break windows, vandalise property, start fires or loot. And if you wanted philosophical guidance, we could also offer up Martin Luther King Jr. for starters, as someone who said protests should be peaceful. Back in Australia, an outlandish and inflammatory statement went unchallenged.
But what I know is that when Barack Obama called the protesters in Baltimore City thugs, that allowed for Donald Trump to now say we should shoot these people at protests.
Kwame, just finally, how do you see these protests calming?
Shooting protesters? Really? Live interviews are difficult for all kinds of reasons, but it would have been better if Fran Kelly had picked up on that overreach. No doubt the statement was a deliberate misconstruction of Trump's tweet last week about restoring law and order in Minneapolis, and that when the looting starts, the shooting starts. A blunt and aggressive warning to criminals, sure, but hardly a pledge to shoot protesters. But Trump derangement syndrome allows everything to be about Trump and anything to be said about his intentions.
Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman has written today that, quote, "The America as we know it is on the brink. Donald Trump seems very close to trying to incite a civil war." Is that just overblown rhetoric? Whether or not the president's inciting it, could it get to that?
Inciting a civil war, hey? Still also on Radio National, a less predictable perspective from an African-American voice.
President Trump says peaceful protesters are being drowned out by an angry mob. Those are his words. Are they being drowned out, or is their message being heard?
No, I believe that President Trump is absolutely correct on this point. They are being drowned out.
President Trump is absolutely correct. That's a sentence you'll not often hear on the ABC. Nor will you often hear this sort of criticism of the political agitators.
Antifa and Black Lives Matter have destroyed the good intentions of the moment of protest.
You're very critical of Black Lives Matter and you know, that you're entitled to your view.
Well, isn't that kind? The Australian Broadcasting Corporation says an African-American woman is entitled to her own view of Black Lives Matter. How generous. But have a listen to this take from an Australian academic.
This morning, Newsweek published a poll that shows that of Minneapolis residents, 54% said they understood and felt that it was justified that protesters had burned down the police precinct. And a massive 78% said that they understood the anger that was underpinning these protests and the longevity of these protests.
So what does the Associate Professor take from that polling showing that more than half of the residents think it was justified to torch a police station?
So to have a poll like that this morning is, again, another sign of hope and quite significant.
Needless to say, host Linda Mottram did not demur. No matter what your angle on this debate is, surely you'd find it difficult to draw hope from that sort of inflammatory, literally inflammatory despair.